Recently, I participated in a webinar, an online seminar, which was about how to lead people in a virtual world. How do we lead in a world that's increasingly being lived online? And it was a really helpful seminar, but to start off in kind of a humorous way. First of all, the presenter, who was very good, actually had trouble with his audio. He couldn't get his audio to work, even though he was teaching us how to lead in a virtual world. And then, more humorously, one of the participants ended up doing the seminar a bit like this. For some reason, he couldn't work out the settings on his camera or his device, and so he was upside down for most of the seminar. Very frustrating for him, somewhat humorous for us. I imagine that this is a bit like how many of us may feel at the moment. Life feels like it's upside down. People feel confused. People feel disconnected in all kinds of ways. And we would love for life to get back to normal as quickly as possible. But we don't know how long that will be, what that will take, what that will even look like when we get back to normal. And so we need to think about what it is like for us at this time where life feels upside down. You know, we're not the first people in history to have our world disrupted, to have our world turned upside down. Last week we started looking at an example of someone who felt this way, who lived just over 2,600 years ago. He's a man with a funny name, Habakkuk. And he has a book in the Bible that bears his name. And he was actually a prophet, and he wrote this prophecy down. And the series, I've called the series that we're looking at for a few weeks, Trusting God in Troubled Times, because that's what Habakkuk's book is all about. Let me give you a quick recap of what we found out last week. Habakkuk wrote in the late 7th century before Christ, and during this time, there was great turmoil in the Mediterranean world. The nation or the empire of Babylon was growing in prominence. And it was attacking other nations and subduing other nations and extending its power and flexing its muscle. Judah was a small nation and was the only expression of God's people left on the planet. Now, in 609 BC, Jehoiakim became the king of Judah. And the Bible says that he reigned for 11 years and that he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And that he led his people, God's people, into doing similar things, evil and wicked things, things that displeased God. And so God's people were facing potential disaster, both from the outside and the inside. On the outside, they faced the threat of invasion from Babylon, this great world superpower that was growing at the time. And they also faced potential disaster from the inside, an implosion from their own wicked behavior. Habakkuk, a prophet of God, had his world turned upside down. Everything seemed out of control for him. And God seemed to be silent about this, almost absent. And so Habakkuk is deeply distressed and he cries out to God. He says this at the beginning of his prophecy: "How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen, or cry out to you violence, but you do not save?" That phrase, cry out, can literally be translated as shout or roar or shriek. Habakkuk is yelling at God. He goes on to say, "Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted." Habakkuk is clearly upset. He's yelling at God. He's yelling at God with a bunch of questions that could probably be summarized in one word, and that is the word why. It's a big question, isn't it, that faces many of us, that perhaps faces the whole of humanity. Why did bad things happen to us? Why does God allow things like this coronavirus, to happen to us? I wonder if you've ever felt a bit like Habakkuk, if you've ever had that question in your heart. Why, God? Why? Perhaps you're feeling like that right now. Maybe you felt it at other times in your life. Well, Habakkuk yells at God, cries out why, and then God answers. And God says, look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed, for I'm going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. God says, it's me. I'm doing this. I'm raising up the Babylonians. Now, I wonder what you would do with an answer like that. If God spoke to you after you yelled at him, what would you do? If it was me, I think I would probably shut my mouth. If I yelled at God and then God suddenly answered, I probably would just be quiet and listen. But not Habakkuk. He goes on with it. He goes on with it with God, and he asks more questions in the next part of chapter 1. He says, Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, we will never die. You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? You've made people like the fish in the sea, like the sea creatures that have no ruler. The wicked foe pulls all of them up with hooks. He catches them in his net. And so he rejoices and is glad. For by his net he lives in luxury and enjoys the choicest food. Is he to keep on emptying his net, destroying nations without mercy? You can kind of hear what Habakkuk is saying in these words. He's kind of coming back at God with another question. The question is, what? What do you mean, God, you're behind all this? What on earth is going on? Habakkuk is struggling with the idea that God would use this evil empire that's threatening to take over the world to judge his own people, no matter how terrible they may be at the moment. Why would God do this? Habakkuk's really struggling. It seems so contrary to what he knows of God, how he's come to know God. We see this in verse 12, where Habakkuk calls out to God and he says, my God, my Holy One, my rock. It's clear that Habakkuk has experienced a close relationship with his Creator. And so this makes God's words, God's strange words, even more difficult to accept. Notice this, though, that Habakkuk's questions drive him toward God, not away from God. And I want to say that if you have hard questions, if you have big questions, difficult questions, the best place to ask those questions is close to God, not away from him. And so Habakkuk's struggling because he knows of God's closeness, but he also knows of God's consistency. He says, Lord, are you not from everlasting? You know, that word everlasting means that God has always been and will always be. God is eternal. One of the Psalms, one of the old songs in the Psalms says this: before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. God is everlasting, and this idea of his consistency comes across in that word because his character never changes. The Bible talks about God's everlasting righteousness, his everlasting kindness, his everlasting love. Now, where Habakkuk says we will never die, he's referring really to the covenant, the promise that God made with the Hebrew people. And that covenant promise was that they would be blessed by God, not to keep it to themselves, but to be a blessing to all nations of the earth. And the way they would be that blessing is by God sending the Messiah to the world through their nation. And so Habakkuk is saying, when he says, we will never die, he's saying, but you promised God that we'll have a special purpose, so surely you are not going to wipe us out. Habakkuk knows of God's closeness. He knows of God's consistency. He knows of God's character. He calls God the Holy One. The Holy One. Holy is a word that means everything that's the complete opposite of evil. Holiness is the complete opposite of everything that's evil. It's ultimate perfection and purity. And so Habakkuk is confused because he's saying in these words, how can you, as a holy God, tolerate evil, let alone use it for your purposes? He says in verse 13, your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? You have made people like the fish in the sea, like the sea creatures who have no ruler. You see, Habakkuk saw his world falling apart. It seemed to him that all humanity was like an ocean full of fish that had no leadership and that were exposed to attacks from predators, from this evil self-serving empire of Babylon. He goes on to say, you've made the people like the fish in the sea, like the sea creatures that have no ruler. The wicked foe pulls all of them up with hooks and catches them with his net. And he goes on to say, is he to keep on emptying his net and destroying nations without mercy? Habakkuk sees his world falling apart, upside down, and worst of all, it seems that God is in on this, that God's behind this. Where was the God he thought he knew? The God who was close, the God who was consistent, the God whose character is pure and holy and good. I wonder if you can relate to those kinds of thoughts. Maybe you're a believer who's struggling at the moment and you're thinking, God, I love you, but I just don't understand. Or maybe you're someone who's not sure about God and you might even be saying, look, I want to believe in you, God, but I just don't know. A survey was done just this week that showed that compared to 1 month ago, just 1 month ago, the number of Australians reporting poor mental health has more than doubled. The number of Aussies who are frequently feeling despair and loneliness has more than tripled. And the number of Australians frequently feeling confusion has increased by more than 5 times. Obviously, right now, COVID-19 is causing chaos everywhere around the world. And even here in this relatively safe country, there's a heightened degree of anxiety and worry and depression and concern and all of the things that go with that. That's what we think of right now. But I wonder what will be the next struggle. When we get through this, what will be the next struggle we face? What will be the next big question that we have to ask? Well, here's another big question for you and for me. Can we ever find peace in our big questions? Can we ever find peace in our struggles? Well, the answer to that is yes, we can. We'll see in just a moment what Habakkuk does next. But first, let's watch this video clip.